I'm going to be talking a little bit about, at an institutional level, some of the things that are driving our decisions around sustainable landscapes, and also about what it takes to move that forward. What does innovation look like, and what does it actually take at an institutional level? So just three big trends that we're seeing right now, and again, there is a higher ed bias here, but I think we're seeing this in municipalities, nonprofits, and for-profits at all. The first is that sustainable landscape practices are becoming the norm. It doesn't take much Googling to find lots of institutions who are doing innovative work in the space. McAllister in St. Paul, for example, in addition to having the goal of being carbon neutral by 2025 and zero waste by 2020, is also adopting a pollinator-friendly approach to their landscape. Another really interesting project is the University of Illinois in Chicago has a climate action implementation plan, which is it's really interesting to see a college in an urban environment thinking about how their infrastructure can actually benefit the environment. The second big theme is that there's a much more integrated approach to buildings and landscapes. So it used to be that we were really focused on the buildings themselves and their energy efficiency, and increasingly the scope of work around any new construction or retrofit is extending further into the landscape. One example here is the Curran Center, which we'll be hearing a little bit more about. This is a building that is one of the few living buildings in the world, meaning that it generates more clean water than it uses, and it generates more electricity than it uses. And the approach to this building is really fascinating because it uses sort of a buffer zone outside the building to enhance the human experience inside. So the outside is covered with, the landscaping is a successional meadow with rainwater, with rain gardens, but the roof is capturing water as well and bringing it into interior planters, which are then humidifying the air and making it a better work environment. One of the factors that's pushing this idea outward from buildings, which tend to get, let's face it, most of the glory when it comes to thinking about sustainability, is certification programs like LEED. With Nielsen, for example, you may notice in Smith College currently we have a crater in the middle of our campus where our library used to be. And as we pursue LEED certification on that project, we have to actually have a 50% reduction in the water use in the landscape to even enter the game to be able to be considered for LEED certification. And so we have actually certifications that are now driving this expansion of thinking about sustainability out into the landscape. All right. The third one is for me probably the most fascinating, which is we simply have a much more expanded scope of what it means to be sustainable. I think it's worth remembering that 20 or 30 years ago when we talked about sustainability, we were ultimately talking about financial sustainability. And so we were talking about, as organizations, using less, producing less waste, and the net benefit was actually just spending less money. With climate change really entering our understanding, the focus then really shifted towards carbon footprint. And even now, and as you heard from the presentations this morning, our understanding of what it means to be sustainable is going so far beyond that. Of course, climate change and mitigation is still so important, but we're now thinking about sustainability in terms of economic impact. So are we creating viable economies? We're thinking about habitat. We're thinking about how our landscape is or is not a wildlife corridor. We're thinking about ecosystem services. And a new, interesting, and emerging field is really thinking about equitable societies as part of sustainability. So how do we make sure that as we, in affluent areas, are doing the work to create sustainable landscapes which benefit us directly, how do we make sure that those in need, communities of color, lower income communities don't get pushed into the areas where they're actually feeling the impacts, and so we need to pull everybody along. As we've explored these ideas here at Smith, one of the things that's been really fascinating to learn is that oftentimes what looks like coordinated institutional level approaches are actually led by just a few people. And so I wanted to bring this up because we're really at a place where sustainable landscape management the folks, I think that everyone in this room is really ahead of the curve. You are innovators and early adopters. You've already bought in to ideas that haven't quite permeated the general consciousness of our society yet. And we've seen this as we've looked at other institutions, that generally they rely on just a few people making important decisions or using the power that they have to make change. And I want to share a couple of those examples from here at Smith. The first is, these really focus on lawn alternatives and management alternatives for turf. The first is in our systematics garden. This is the garden that's just outside of Lyman Conservatory. And as we started to have conversations at Smith about where we can demonstrate lower input lawns, I had a conversation with our landscape curator, John Berryhill, who's in the back, and he said, well, you know we have one. It's the systematics garden. This is a space that's managed by our gardener and curator, Jeff Rankin. And really what happened is that he didn't want to use synthetic applications of pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers, and so when people stopped asking him to, he just stopped doing it. So this is a garden that the turf had one annual synthetic application of fertilizer between 2008 and 2012, and it hasn't had any since then. And it's had one herbicide application since 2012. And again, this was just because Jeff sort of flew under the radar and waited. And now I'm here telling you what a great job Jeff did by doing less, at least with the turf. It's a space where we can see sort of, it's a more diverse lawn. Some might call it weedy. We have some thinner spots, but the reality is that I didn't even know that we were doing less inputs on this space until somebody brought it up to me. Another big success for us is a project on Hospital Hill. Hospital Hill is our largest contiguous lawn at Smith, although it's not connected to the core of campus. And really through some student projects, they daylighted the idea that this was a low-use space that we could drastically reduce our mowing inputs on. These students, over a course of a couple of years and a couple of different student groups, finally got the ear of Dana Weisbord, our Director of Sustainability and Campus Planning, who got the ear of Carla Youngblood, our Facilities Operations Director. Carla's also in the audience here. And they began talking about how they could make this happen. Through a collaboration with Bob Domkowski, they started to work with the folks who actually do the mowing to figure out what the pitfalls were. And our mowers expressed real concern that if they stopped mowing when they had to go in there might be obstacles that would be dangerous to run over, that might become a slippery slope if the turf became, or if the ground became too saturated, that their mowers wouldn't be able to handle it. And they came up with a backup plan, which is they were going to simply try it, and if it didn't work, they would hire in whatever was needed to actually make the cut. And so they trialed it this last year, and they found that they actually really liked doing it. And so next year they're planning to just mow this twice over the entire year, whereas they had been mowing this on our normal mowing interval, which was every 5 to 10 days during the growing season. So a huge reduction through some really, through a very targeted approach to where we could make some easy progress, and then also incorporating all the people who actually have to do the work themselves to make sure that it was going to work for them, so they were on board. The final project was that I'm going to talk about today was a byproduct of a turf conversion. In 2010, Smith built its synthetic turf fields, and as part of that project, we actually impacted about 200 feet of wetland. And so there was an agreement with the city to do mitigation on about 4.4 acres of land around Paradise Pond, which we are blessed with this wonderful view today. Between 2010 and 2015, Botanic Garden interns, facility staff, and Botanic Garden staff worked to identify and begin the process of invasive species removal on part of the waterfront through hand removal and then targeted cut stump and herbicide applications. In 2016, a company called Land Stewardship Incorporated took over a contract for doing the control of woody invasive species through cut stump applications of herbicides and then spot treatment spot treatments of foliar applications, and our interns continue to do the work of monitoring the progress of this to build a case for whether or not it was working or not. And it's actually been a very successful project for us. If you look at the left, you can see in 2016 large swaths of large contiguous swaths of invasive species, and in 2018 you can see that there's been a huge reduction in the total area that's covered by invasives, and that these spaces have become much less contiguous. As an outsider, from an outsider's perspective, it might be easy to look at some of these initiatives and think that everyone at Smith is on board. Sustainable landscape practices are prioritized in our report of the Smith College Study Group on Climate Change as a way to mitigate our climate impact. And they're also laid out in our current strategic plan as high priorities to make sure that our operations are environmentally sustainable. But the reality is that a lot of these projects simply moved forward because a couple of people took the initiative to move them forward. I'm really excited about a couple of new initiatives that'll be coming out for Smith College. The first is that we have a landscape master plan in progress right now, and we hope to be completing that by the spring of 2020. For us, this is a chance to really re-envision the way we think about our landscape as simply being the space on which people walk to get to classes and do the learning, into spaces where learning is actively happening, but also into spaces that are truly bioproductive and part of our ecosystem. The Botanic Garden of Smith College is also working on a strategic plan which we'll be releasing in the spring of 2019, and among the initiatives is greening our landscape practices, including looking at all electric fleets and really assessing where we might be able to switch to organic practices. So just a quick summary slide. When we look at making change, it's really easy to be overwhelmed by what we see and to see institutions that appear to be doing better and to feel like we're behind the curve. But the reality is that it only really takes three things. It takes a few dedicated people who are willing to at least put in the time and the effort. It takes a few success stories to really build on. And it takes an ability to leverage institutional priorities so that the work actually makes sense to the institution you're working in, whether this is financial goals or strategic goals. And by doing these three things, this really simple roadmap, we can start to really build some momentum within our institutions. All right, thank you.